Let me start with a number I want you to hold in your head for the entire video: 40%. That is roughly the share of Europe's liquefied natural gas imports that pass, directly or indirectly, through waters that Iran can now credibly threaten, not Russian pipelines, not North Sea platforms, waters. And in the last several weeks, while every camera in the world was pointed at the Strait of Hormuz and the standoff between Washington and Tehran, almost nobody was looking at the second choke point, the quieter one, the one that actually determines whether a French household can heat its home in January or whether a German factory can keep its production line running. Today, I want to walk you through exactly how Iran, without firing a single missile at a European target in the early phase of this conflict, has managed to put the continent's energy security back into a crisis it has not faced since the winter after Russia cut the pipelines. And I want to show you why almost every mainstream outlet is missing the actual mechanism, because they keep looking at oil prices at the pump when the real story is happening in the LNG spot market, in insurance premiums, and in a handful of quiet diplomatic cables that European governments are not eager to talk about. Before we continue, if you've ever wondered why Israel and Iran have hated each other for over 40 years, I've put together a complete ebook that explains the entire story from the origins of the conflict to the key events that shaped it. I won't go into all the details here, but if you'd like to learn more, you'll find the link in the pinned comment below. Now let's get back to the video. Let's set the stage properly. After 2022, when Russian pipeline gas to Europe collapsed, the continent did something remarkable. It rebuilt its entire energy architecture around liquefied natural gas. Ships instead of pipes. The United States became Europe's single largest LNG supplier almost overnight. Qatar became the second pillar, and a smaller but still meaningful slice, particularly for southern European countries and for the older long-term contracts that predate the crisis, still flows out of the Gulf, through Hormuz, around the Arabian Peninsula, and up through the Suez Canal, or around the Cape, into the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. That route, Gulf to Suez to Europe, was supposed to be the safe one, the boring one, the one nobody worried about, because the real drama was always in Ukraine or in the Red Sea with the Houthis. Nobody built their risk models around Iran directly threatening Mediterranean-bound energy shipping, because for years Iran's leverage was assumed to be regional, Hormuz, the Gulf, not Europe's actual doorstep. That assumption just broke, and it broke in a way that I think most analysts are still catching up to. Here is the first thing you need to understand. Iran does not need to close the Suez Canal to hurt Europe. It does not need a single missile to land on European soil. All it needs to do is make insurers nervous. That's it. That is the entire mechanism, and it is far more powerful than people realize. When a tanker carrier or an LNG shipping company calculates whether to send a vessel through a contested corridor, the decision is not made by a naval officer weighing military risk. It is made by an actuary in London or Zurich, weighing insurance cost against alternative routing cost. And once Iranian-linked strikes started reaching into the Mediterranean, hitting LNG carriers near Egyptian export terminals, war risk insurance premiums on any vessel transiting that corridor spiked immediately, not doubled, in some reported cases multiplied several times over within days. When the cost of insuring a single voyage rises that sharply, shipping companies do one of two things. They either pass the cost straight through to the buyer, which shows up months later as a price spike on your gas bill, or they simply reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding roughly 2 weeks and enormous fuel costs to every single voyage. Either way, Europe pays. There is no version of this where Europe doesn't pay. Now let's talk about why this is happening now and not 6 months ago. I want to introduce you to a concept that I think explains almost everything about Iranian strategy in this conflict. Analysts have started calling it horizontal escalation. The idea is simple. When you are losing ground on your primary battlefield, in this case the direct confrontation with American and Israeli air power over Iranian territory, you do not concede. You widen the map. You find a theatre where your adversary's allies are exposed and your own cost of action is comparatively low. Striking near an LNG terminal in the eastern Mediterranean, whether through a drone, through a proxy, or simply through the credible threat of doing so again, costs Iran almost nothing militarily. It does not require them to win a single engagement against the US Navy. It requires them to demonstrate reach. And reach, once demonstrated, does not need to be repeated constantly to remain effective. The insurance markets remember, the shipping companies remember, the threat becomes self-enforcing long after the actual strike has faded from the headlines. This is where I want to bring in the second piece of the puzzle, because energy is only half of this story. The other half is Europe's political fracture, and Iran understands that fracture better than most European leaders are willing to admit publicly. Since the pipeline gas from Russia disappeared, European unity on energy policy has been held together by one shared assumption, that American LNG and Gulf LNG together would be enough to replace what was lost at a price the continent could tolerate. That assumption held for a couple of relatively mild winters. It is now being tested in a way it has never been tested before, because you have two simultaneous shocks hitting the same market. American LNG export capacity is not infinite, and much of it is already spoken for under long-term contracts with Asian buyers, who are notably willing to pay a premium to secure supply amid their own tensions with China over the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. And now the Gulf to Mediterranean route, the one route that gave Europe some flexibility and price competition against American suppliers, is suddenly carrying a war risk premium that makes it economically unattractive. What happens when the price of a scarce commodity rises sharply across an entire continent in the middle of winter demand season? You get exactly what happened in the winter of 2022, except this time European governments do not have the same fiscal room to subsidize household energy bills that they had back then. Public debt levels across the major European economies are already elevated. Germany is still working through years of industrial stagnation tied to the loss of cheap Russian gas. France is dealing with its own political instability. Italy is managing a fragile coalition. None of these governments have the appetite or frankly the money to run the kind of emergency subsidy programs they ran 3 years ago. So when energy prices spike this time, the political consequence will not be absorbed by government spending. It will be absorbed directly by voters in their bills, in their factories, in their jobs. And that is precisely the pressure point Iran appears to be targeting, whether by design or by the natural logic of horizontal escalation. You do not need to defeat the United States militarily. You can make its closest allies politically unstable enough that they start pulling away from the coalition supporting Washington's approach. And here is where the picture gets genuinely uncomfortable, because I want to walk you through what European governments are actually doing behind closed doors right now, as opposed to what they are saying in public statements. Publicly, the European Union has largely stood behind the American position, calling for de-escalation, condemning attacks on commercial shipping, reaffirming solidarity with allies in the region. That is the public shadow on the wall. Privately, according to multiple reports from European diplomatic sources, a number of member states have begun quiet outreach through intermediary channels, exploring whether guarantees of safe passage for their own flagged vessels or their own contracted energy shipments could be negotiated separately from the broader US-Iran confrontation. This is not new behavior for smaller and mid-sized states caught between great powers. It is exactly what the Gulf states themselves have been doing throughout this war, quietly seeking their own arrangements with Tehran, even while hosting American forces, Europe is now discovering the same incentive structure. When your energy security is on the line and your closest ally cannot guarantee the safety of the routes you depend on, you start looking for your own deal, regardless of what the official alliance position says. I want to be very careful here because this is exactly the kind of claim that deserves scrutiny rather than blind acceptance. I am not telling you that any specific European government has struck a secret bilateral agreement with Iran. What I am telling you is that the incentive to do exactly that has become extremely strong, and that the historical pattern going back decades shows that European states have never been shy about pursuing energy security independently of Washington when the situation demanded it. France maintained its own channels with various Middle Eastern actors throughout the Cold War, specifically to protect its energy interests. Germany built the entire Nord Stream relationship with Russia over the explicit objections of the United States for exactly the same reason. Energy dependency creates its own foreign policy, one that does not always match the alliance's official line. That is not speculation. That is the documented history of how European energy security decisions actually get made. Now let's talk about the number that I think should be the headline of every European newspaper right now, and somehow is not. Natural gas storage levels heading into this winter across the major European economies were already running below the multi-year average before this latest phase of Iranian escalation even began. Add a war risk premium on Gulf to Mediterranean shipping, add the diversion of American LNG cargoes to higher paying Asian buyers, and you get a storage deficit that European utilities cannot simply purchase their way out of at a reasonable price. When that happens, the market does what markets do. Price rations the scarce good, and the households and small businesses least able to absorb a price shock are always the first to feel it. This is not an abstract geopolitical talking point. This is the difference between a pensioner in Eastern Germany affording heat through February and having to choose between heating and food, a choice that Europe has already lived through once this decade and swore it would never repeat. Let me bring in the framework that I think ties all of this together, because I do not think what we are watching is chaos. I think it is calculated. In classical strategic theory, there is a concept called coercive linkage. The idea that a weaker power facing a stronger coalition will attempt to attack the coalition not at its strongest point, but at the seam where the interests of its members diverge. The United States can absorb higher energy prices domestically far more easily than Europe can, because America is now a net energy exporter. Europe is not. That asymmetry is precisely the seam Iran appears to be probing. Every strike near a Mediterranean-bound energy shipment, every spike in insurance premiums, every quiet diplomatic cable from a European capital exploring separate arrangements widens that seam a little further. You do not need to break the American-European alliance in one dramatic moment. You need to apply pressure at the exact point where their interests diverge, and let the pressure compound week after week, bill after bill, until the political cost of standing fully behind Washington's approach becomes higher than the political cost of quietly stepping back. I want to be fair here and give you the strongest counter-argument, because I never want you to just accept my framework without stress testing it. The counter-argument goes like this. Europe has weathered worse energy shocks before and adapted. After the Russian gas cutoff, European storage infrastructure, LNG import terminal capacity, and demand reduction programs all improved dramatically faster than almost anyone predicted. Germany built floating LNG terminals in record time. The continent as a whole cut gas demand substantially through efficiency measures and industrial adaptation. It is entirely possible that European energy markets, having already been through one brutal adjustment, are simply more resilient this time around, and that what looks like an emerging crisis is actually a market absorbing a shock the way it has learned to. That is a real argument, and it deserves respect. But here is what that argument does not account for. The 2022 shock was a supply shock with a known fixed cause, the loss of Russian pipeline gas, and the entire continent mobilized around solving that one specific problem. What is happening now is a compounding shock, insurance costs rising on top of an already tight storage picture, on top of competition from Asian buyers, on top of a political fracture that did not exist in the same form back then. Resilience built to solve one kind of shock does not automatically transfer to a shock with a completely different shape and a completely different set of pressure points. So let me give you 3 specific things to watch over the coming weeks, because that is how you test whether this framework holds up against reality rather than just theory. First, watch war risk insurance premiums, specifically on the Gulf to Mediterranean LNG corridor. If those premiums continue climbing rather than stabilizing, that tells you shipping companies and insurers believe the threat is durable, not a one-time event. Second, watch for any European government quietly softening its public rhetoric on Iran, while simultaneously increasing diplomatic engagement through intermediary states like Oman or Qatar. That combination, public firmness paired with private outreach, is the exact signature of a government pursuing its own separate energy arrangement without wanting to be seen doing it. Third, and this is the one I think matters most, watch the spread between American LNG contract prices and European spot market prices this winter. If that spread widens significantly, it means Europe is being forced to compete at the margin for scarce cargoes, and that is when household energy bills start moving in a direction that becomes a genuine political problem for whichever governments are in power when the bills arrive. Here is your homework, and I mean this genuinely. I want you to look up the most recent reporting on European gas storage levels compared to the 5-year average for this time of year. I want you to look at reported war risk insurance rate changes on Mediterranean shipping routes since the escalation began.